I love doing programs when I know nothing about the subject. I mean, I've been interviewing people about health for years, and when I interview people about health, I almost know the answer. But when it comes to this subject, I know nothing, and I'm so
Wow.
excited to learn. I'm going to be talking about cryptocurrency with an
Yeah.
expert, Dan Mechem, cryptocurrency. Dan Mechem coming in right after this.
The Dr. Brian McDonough Show.
Dan, it's great to talk to you. I will start full disclosure. Dan and I go way back, working together in, I guess, the late 80s, early 90s. This is Dan Mechem as a reporter interviewing somebody. I think I know that guy. And that was you many years ago as a reporter for Fox 29 in Philadelphia, which at the time, I guess, no, we weren't even Fox 29. We were just WTXF-TV, I guess. And it later became Fox 29.
That's right. Yeah, I think in the latter years, that's right. Yeah.
But it's great. The great thing about social media and the internet is probably in another time, another age, we would have lost each other to history and said, "Oh, I remember that guy." But now you get to keep up. I mean, I've seen you on LinkedIn. I see when you have different articles, different things, and it's fun to follow people. And I want to talk about you in a little bit. But before that, while we still have the audience, they usually stay for 7 or 8 minutes. I want to tell everybody to subscribe. My son told me that. Make sure you get people to subscribe if you have a channel. But the second thing, which is really important, is I want to talk about cryptocurrency. And I know you know a lot about it. I know next to nothing. And everybody I talk to seems to know next to nothing unless they're involved in it. So tell me a little bit, what is cryptocurrency? Why is it causing so much excitement? Why is it so risky? Why is it making people fortunes? Tell me a little about it.
Sure. Well, as a backdrop to this, long after I was a reporter at Fox 29, I guess it's about 3.5 years ago, I was fortunate enough to make a good amount of money. And I kind of had this epiphany that although I had an advisor at Morgan Stanley, I didn't really feel like he was that, in terms of his aptitude for what was going on in the market, my money, maybe talking to him every year and getting a Harry and David basket, just not really that focused on my money. And so that led to this journey, being an ex-reporter, really, where I thought, this is money. I need to read voraciously about it. I need to understand it. And that led to this desire to say, you know what, I need to do this myself. And the culmination of that, the crescendo of that, was creating the Money Protector, which I trademarked. That's my company, where we have a wealth advisory. We advise people on all different kinds of things relating to money. I've assembled really an amazing team all over the country: CPAs, state attorneys, crypto experts, you name it. And I'd say the common denominator is people our age, frankly, don't know that much about their money. So I've written a book, which I just finished. It's coming out in the fall, called Get to Know Your Money.
Oh, great.
And the first half of it is really that very subject, and kind of understanding the underlying reasons to this dysfunction. Why are people not understanding their money and really getting to know it as well as they should? And then over the last, again, in keeping with sort of the reporter in me, I had the pleasure and really good fortune, literally, to interview the super rich. Through people I grew up with, others that I've met through business. My thought was, well, look, if you want to understand how to build wealth, why not talk to the people that do it best, right? So I had this access to people, many of whom are over 100 million or even $1 billion, to talk about how they make money. And like a reporter, in exchange for anonymity, they didn't want to, have me use their name. They sort of spilled the beans and say, here's what I do. Here's how I build it. Here's what my team does. Here's how I pay little or no tax. Here's what I do with crypto. So that's the foundation to kind of understanding crypto. I guess the best use of my time on crypto, instead of getting kind of a 101 definition as a digital currency, if you don't mind, is just me giving my own opinion on the entire subject.
That's great.
So I'm deeply concerned about what's happening right now overall with crypto. So, for example, there was an article yesterday in Forbes magazine talking about how now certain companies are peddling 401ks with the ability to use, crypto inside of it. When you're our age, you need to be thinking defense. That's a lot of why I created the Money Protector. You've done a lot of offense. Hopefully you've done well, you built, but you need to think of defensive strategies. And when I see, something as volatile and really wild as crypto, inside a traditional 401k, it just drives me crazy because uh, the reality is, and you don't hear this in the news, the majority of crypto, people out there that are investing are losing. It's only the top couple of percent that are gaining, and in some cases making enormous gains. You don't hear about the losers, right? You hear about the winners. And why is that? Because there are a lot of people on Wall Street peddling it and others that want people to buy crypto. So in its essence, it's a digital currency. There's a variety of different kinds that you can get. That it's in and of itself is sort of a dizzying array of things to look at. But I would just say, from my vantage point, and I really have researched it, talked to lots of experts about it. Boy, you got to be wary about crypto. I've met people, even one of my clients before I started working with them, that invested and went out and took out loans, almost like an actor would take out a loan to become, to try to make it, and leveraging themselves highly just to get into crypto because of the sex appeal. So it is a highly, highly risky endeavor. So for me, one of my frustrations at the Money Protector is seeing traditional institutions and companies get behind putting crypto in a 401k, giving people the opportunity to do that. To me, that's insane. That's the last thing you should be doing. Your 401k, your IRA, Roth, whatever you have, needs to be sacred. It needs to be, so you don't want to risk it, right? So that's kind of my unique perspective. You won't hear that from many people because a lot of these same companies are peddling it and they want to make money off it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I was looking for some photos just to put up as graphics, and everything with crypto is like this. Boom.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Boom. Boom. It looks
Absolutely.
very dramatic. It looks wonderful. It looks alluring.
It's sexy.
And it's sexy. And you're like, hey, I don't want to miss out on this.
Yeah.
Late 80s, I could have done this. I could have done that. I'm going to get it with crypto. And you're right. This age group theoretically could be vulnerable when they are the most vulnerable.
Well, the most telling stat that I saw, and I don't remember if it was Forbes or Kipling or one of the others, the majority of millennials expect that they will be able to retire on cryptocurrency with the investments. Now that is just fanciful thinking. I mean, again, it's and now that's another thing to keep in mind here that is reported a lot, but you need to factor in enormous fraud, enormous hacking going on, with Bitcoin, with all of the cryptocurrency. There's no standards, there's no kind of SEC, all of that's very vague. But the reality is that, a lot of these things are very vulnerable to attack. And we've seen some major breaches even over the last few weeks where, these have happened. So you start to see these volatile drops. My opinion is, look, we're in a very volatile time in this country. Right? The economy's crazy. We're in a war, pandemic, everything's wild, right? This is not the time, in my opinion, to be investing in something like that. Now, having said that, I have people that I work with, more traditional advisors that advise some of their clients to say, look, okay, if you have some play money that you might use to go to Vegas, okay, you can experiment a little bit here and there, but don't put it in your 401k. Don't expect to retire on it.
So in other words, when you say it's digital currency, like, you think of the dollar's backed by the government, these sorts of things. What's digital currency backed by? I mean, how's that work?
It's kind of evolving, and over time, it is built upon the rails of the blockchain, and blockchain in and of itself is a whole other kind of definition, but it does ride on those rails. And I think actually your point is interesting because in many respects that's part of the problem, right? There is this sort of vague, obtuse aspect to it that it's built on the blockchain, it's decentralized, there's all different kinds, but again, there's not much regulation. I know that there's talk of doing that. Congress is even talking of doing it. That makes me very nervous, that there aren't those guarantees. Let me mention another interesting thing I included in my book. Another thing people don't think about. So let's say that you went ahead and took the gamble and said, you know what, I'm going to go get, a bunch of Bitcoin and I'm going to put $100,000 into it. Well, what happens to that if you die? What happens to this digital currency? Well, this is problematic because you're dealing with a decentralized blockchain, right? Lots of different, what they call token holders that might have, parts of this. So how does that go to your trust, or how is that passed on to another generation when you've got that kind of complexity? There are attorneys that I'm working with that are beginning to build trusts specifically for crypto. But again, that's an evolving field. So the best thing I would say about it is it's a Wild West. And if you want to get in, that's fine. But it's extraordinarily risky.
The other thing I want to ask you about are NFTs.
Yeah.
Now, again, talking to younger people, they say, well, the value is really not the image that we're getting. The value is more, I get to use a place in Aspen, or I get to do this or that. What is this all about? Because it's also getting a lot of attention.
Well, to my mind, NFTs are they are risky too, but there is more meat on the bone. So it's a non-fungible token. It's really a digital contract for really whatever you want. Now, it again, this is something like Bitcoin or cryptocurrency that sounds a bit vague, right? And a bit, well, what do you mean? And there are people now that are talking about doing real estate contracts, and Gary Vanderzee, who I have a lot of respect for online, talks a lot about it in glowing terms. He's made a lot of money on it. I will say that I think NFT, if it's properly put together, a particular project, it can be quite effective and it can be quite, lucrative. But again, we're talking about something very new, something that's not very regulated. But I've seen a lot more people that I trust and really respect go into very surgically, go into certain types of NFTs and do extremely well. But to me, it's less risky. But again, it's something that, boy, you got to go in eyes wide open, right? This is contracts. It's going to usher in a revolution of, well, how do banks deal right now with their customers and other institutions, even in my business? Well, the blockchain and NFTs are going to dramatically affect that and maybe even replace some of these things. So I really think that this is the Web 3.0, or I know people use it different terms, but NFTs to me are much more interesting than crypto. Crypto is very sexy, but highly risky. Again, there's people that I know doing NFTs the right way that are doing well.
So these are things you obviously got to go in with your eyes open,
Yeah.
understand. And I'm getting the impression, Dan, this is not a quick hit. You hear those stories. It reminds me a lot of how, like, let's face it, nobody goes to the casino and tells you when they lose. They don't tell you when they have a bad stock.
Exactly right.
They always share when things went well. Oh, I did this. They don't usually share. I get the sense you got a lot of that going on.
There is, and as I said, you never hear from the tens of thousands of people that just lost all kinds of money from a hacking and a ransomware that just happened, and a data breach with one of the crypto companies. So it's and the majority of the crypto companies, I don't know if you've seen it, but out where I live in the LA area, all of a sudden, out of the blue, this crypto company comes in and buys the Staples Center, right? And the naming rights, and that kind of shows you that that it's arrived. But to me, I look at it as we've seen, Brian, you and I are at the age where we've seen shiny objects come and go, and this to me though is the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution. These major forces in our country's history. It is that significant.
So let's go back. Like you say, we've seen a lot. It's interesting you talk about your reporting career, and to go back to that time, it was an amazing place to work because, frankly, it was an experiment. I mean, Fox wasn't Fox yet. It was an opportunity where a young news director took a lot of people, took chances on them, said, give it a shot, and tried to create what it ultimately became a really good news team. Like all news teams, I think over time, local news has kind of hit problems. But at that time, there was funding and there was a lot of backing. But when I look back on it, a lot of the skills I learned as a reporter are so transferable. And you kind of referred to that too. Like you're a reporter, you certainly interview Nixon and do things like that. But you talk about how you use that skill set throughout life. Tell me a little about that.
Well, it's a fascinating question to me. A lot of ways it goes back to my education at Kenyon College in Ohio, where I had a really great liberal arts education, reading Aristotle and Plato and Descartes and all these things, but learning how to think critically and learning how to write. And so when I was fortunate enough to become John McCain's press secretary right out of college, a lot of it is that experience at Kenyon really prepared me. So I felt very confident, even though I didn't know what I was doing at age 21 for a couple months. But that led to this idea that I want to outthink other people, not competitively, but I want to be able to do that. And when I became a reporter, that same skill applied. I remember in the early days at Channel 29, coming home after a story into the newsroom and finishing my story, writing it in 10 minutes, and other reporters would be spending an hour and a half. So that did me well. I think more recently, the whole thing about, as I alluded to earlier, about my journey with money was falling back on that same kind of DNA that I have, that anatomy of asking questions, wanting to investigate, wanting to know the truth, because I saw a lot of what I would call, to borrow a phrase, fake financial news. And I still see it today. There's all kinds of fake news in the financial media, selling products, just what I told you about earlier about the 401k and crypto, and people don't really see that. So it did come naturally to me, and that's really what led to my book. And maybe even some of the people, these wealthy people I talked to, felt more comfortable talking to me because they knew I was a reporter.
Mm-hmm.
They felt like they could trust me. And again, I approached it just like I would be doing a story where I gave them anonymity. They didn't want to go on the record, but I was able to use some really incredible insights about the super rich that I never knew about how they make all this money. And really, it's all in the book. The book's coming out this fall.
And again, what's the name of the book?
It's called Get to Know Your Money.
Okay.
And I really, like I said, I've spent the last 3 years working on it, did hundreds of interviews with the super rich. And again, the idea was, okay, it was sort of this one night I was thinking to myself years ago, all right, if I want to really teach people how to build wealth and how to protect it, if I want to be the money protector, what's the best way to do it? Well, why don't you talk to the people that know? And that's the super rich. They obviously are good at making money and protecting it. And in that process, I learned a lot of incredibly valuable, really secrets that are kind of revealed in the book that I didn't know about, that I think are very, going to be highly valuable. And again, in the context of doing the book, like a reporter, I learned very interestingly, after I talked to a whole wide swath of people, different demographics, different amounts of money, that didn't have confidence in what they were doing with their money, didn't have a plan for retirement, didn't have a plan to protect their money even after the 2008 meltdown, where they may have gotten really hit hard. So some of it, not to get too deep, or go down the rabbit hole, but some of it is traced back to our education system. Very woeful lack of education, right? About finances, about money. Nobody's taught that in school. I see that Florida is starting to do that. Some states are getting to it. It's almost unimaginable that Americans are not taught about money, are not taught about insurance, are not taught about Wall Street, are not taught about how to value a company, a valuation, or how to do a business plan.
Do you think that's intentional? Do you think people who had money were trying not to share that information, or do you think there was a lack of interest? Why do you think?
That's a good question. I don't think it's a conspiracy in that regard, but I do think that there is an old boys club. I mean, I certainly saw it. Mostly men, a lot of these guys that are making massive amounts of money. It is a game. I mean, the way these guys look at it is, and I went to like some of these bridge games to them where they're talking to me about different things. All these guys, probably $1 billion in the room with 5 guys there, and kind of talking about how they're putting it to the IRS and how because it's a game in a way, and they're kind of competitive about it. How do you pay the least amount of tax or no tax? So they have an armada of people around them, very, very smart people, not just CPAs, but they have other people that I never knew about. One's called a tax strategist. Tax strategists are these guys that have read the tax code maybe 10 times and do proactive tax planning and tax mitigation. That, CPAs are so busy doing people's taxes, Brian, they don't really look ahead that much to do advanced tax planning. But I'll tell you, the super rich do. And these tax strategists that I use for my clients are incredible. Often, they usually are, saving people hundreds of thousands of dollars in their taxes. And there's a whole other thing that I learned that super rich people do that I never knew about. They use charitable giving in many cases, not just for a deduction, but to save an enormous amount on tax. There are certain kinds of trusts that you can use where you give, very generously to a charity, but you have a much, much larger tax write-off and tax savings by using these charitable trusts. So, there's so much to learn about this. And I'm not doing it from the standpoint of, I want to be a billionaire. I want to be like the super rich. I just want to distill what they've learned and give it to everyone that reads this book, no matter how much money you have, because almost all of it can be applied. Of course, real estate's very important to them as well. One of the things that they use, you may or may not heard of, which is an amazing tool, is called a 1031 exchange. So you have this property, and as you trade up to get other properties, instead of selling it, When you sell that property, it becomes a taxable event, right, to the IRS. But if you don't and use a 1031, you keep flipping it, in doing more and more houses. And in most states, and I guarantee 99% of your audience won't know this, in most states, as you do that, let's say you accumulate $2 million of real estate by the end of your life. If you don't sell that real estate and you die and it goes on to your heirs, it passes to them tax-free. Now, Congress has been making noises about changing that.
Right.
That's just a bit of a taste of, wow, this motherload of things that the super rich are doing that I'm trying to teach people.
And what about people now? They're looking at, interest rates are going up. They might have the money in the stock market and bonds, and they're trying to play, where do I put it? Am I going to lose money in the stock market? But with the rates going up, that can't be good for bonds. And they're like, I don't know what to do with it. What do they do? I mean, if they're using stocks and bonds, are they trapped?
Well, I would say this, again, my perspective, I'm 61 now. So my perspective, and the reason I started the Money Protector is there's a certain skill set to traditional advisors and financial planners where they stay in a lane. That's what they do. They're not focused on taxes and tax mitigation because in many cases they're regulated and they can. But I really think that it's time to play defense. And the skill sets that those guys have, they're playing offense. And this is part of what I learned in researching and talking to these guys, that there is a very profound lack of education, and they're not even incentivized to do so, to play defense. So as a general proposition, I think as people look at everything right now, you do need to think about playing defense. In my book, I give 4 or 5 strategies that people can do specifically to play defense. And everyone's different. It's certainly not crypto. The most important thing to me is it all comes down to taxes, right? And what I said with tax mitigation. What we use a lot is I have a strategic partner that has been using a tax shelter that's unbelievable, that is essentially bulletproof. The money grows tax-free. And not only is it a great defensive tool, but it also, on average, over the last 6 years, their clients have earned, along with me, between 12 and 24%, which is a very, very high amount. But that's a good example of, well, where would you put your money? To me, a tax shelter where you can't lose money. It's in a shelter that's protected and structured so that it's kind of like a Brinks truck, but there's also upside. So to me, the traditional wisdom is get in the market, diversify your portfolio. One of the most fascinating things to me, Brian, about the super rich that I interviewed, I was shocked, and I still am shocked about this. And I'm talking about the really wealthy people. There's a lot of them, they're not even in the market. Now, why are they not in the market? Because the market with capital gains is the very definition of triggering a taxable event, right? No matter what you do, you are slave to that capital gains tax. I'm also not a big fan of 401ks and traditional, what they call qualified funds, because if you think about it, the government's on a spending spree, right? So eventually you have to pay tax on that. We all know taxes are going to go up, right? Especially with how crazy things are going.
Right.
So even though you don't want to do it, it's kind of like taking your medicine. You got to pay those taxes off now and get the money to somewhere that's going to grow tax-free and and grow with compound interest. So I think it's that. And then here's a very important thing that I put in my book, and it's controversial, and some people can't, kind of understand it. One of the most shocking things to me about what people do with their money, especially now when people are afraid with the economy and everything that's going on, is they put an inordinate amount of money in their checking account or their savings account. So let's think about that for a minute. Now, of course, we all have to have something in the checking account, but if you're putting in, 50,000, 100 or 200, whatever the amount is, into your savings and getting less than 1% interest, that's being ravaged by inflation. I have a friend of mine that I work with a lot. He goes, I'm sorry, but that's the definition of insanity. There are many places that you can put that money. They're going to get 5 to 10 or 15%, very, very safe. But people are afraid, because their parents always told them, well, you know what? Put it in the savings account. It's safe there. There are places that I think are much better. There's a tool called Cash Value Life Insurance, which I'm a huge fan of. That is basically an insurance policy, but instead of the focus on the death benefit, the focus is on the return, right? The investment And, they're getting, depending on the policies and how they're structured, between 6 and 8%, sometimes 10. But to me, it's time to play defense. That's really the core of what to do. And the market, I feel like, is the market an essential thing? To me, it's not necessarily the case.
Interesting. And Dan Mechem, I want to thank you for joining us. It's funny. One of the books I've been reading recently is nothing about money, but Retiring Happy. And that was another point, that so many people don't think about what their interests are, or who their friends are, or what they're going to do. And you hear stories all the time. People retire and they die shortly after.
Yeah.
But what they're saying is it's a combined. You certainly, if you don't have money, it's harder to be happy. And yet, if you're not happy, the money doesn't help you either. It's that combination. And obviously, we all try to stay healthy. That's your other thing. You need the luck and the good fortune of being healthy. But this is great stuff. One last question. Anything I didn't ask you that you wish I had asked you that you want to?
Well, I'll just, if you have a few more minutes, I'll expound on the retirement thing, because I do think it's really important. First of all, I'm glad you're reading that, and my book has a lot in it. I think a treasure trove about retirement. The very definition of retirement for baby boomers is changing. It's different than our parents that had Social Security and a pension. Retirement to me is not that I stop working. It's that I don't have to work, or I have enough passive income coming in where I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to worry about running out of money in retirement. There are, again, when I talked to you earlier about, fake news in the financial press, a lot of fake news about how to do it. A lot of people that are out there trying to take advantage of people our age and getting them into things that are going to potentially lose money. So, but I would say, again, a lot of it is retiring happy means understanding, like in my book, understanding how to get to know your money, right? Understanding what's important to you, to your family. So, for example, if you have kids, you really need to think about generational wealth. You need to think very carefully about that. And what shocks me is you'd be amazed at how few people, even wealthy people, have taken the time to set up a trust, that have taken the time to set up an estate plan. And that's crazy. And I'll tell you why. Prince, the famous musician, is a good example of this. He just said, you know what? I'm not going to set up a trust. Well, now it's just a complete bedlam. When you don't set up a trust, it goes into what's called probate, and the government takes a big cut. So there's a lot, I think, when you're thinking about retirement, where you really need to look at the blocking and tackling, I think, first. And I guess the last thing I would say is, just going back to the old Channel 29 days, I wanted to tell you a couple of funny stories. I used to work with Brad Now, the photographer, a lot.
Oh, great photographer.
Yeah, he was a great guy. One of my favorite stories is there was a big murder case in Mays Landing, New Jersey, and the guy that was accused of it, we went down to the trial, and his name was Robert Marshall, and we covered it for a while. And by the way, what was interesting about this is, during this time, I was competing against Brian Williams, who was then at the CBS station. So I saw Brian there every day.
Yeah.
The jury went out, and they were out for a while. And I don't drink very much, but one night, before we drove down to New Jersey, I had a few drinks, and I was a little hungover the next day. We went to the courtroom. Maybe the jury's going to come out, maybe not. And I told Brad, you know what? I'm just going to lay down in the news van. If anything happens, just come get me. So I fall asleep. All of a sudden, like out of a dream, he comes to the news van and hits on it. Dan, there's a verdict. There's a verdict. So I come out, kind of groggy, and I look, and I'm like, oh my God, the national news media, Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York, they're all there. We don't have a position to get the shot. But because we'd been there so often, I told Brad, I said, you know what? There's only one hope. Let's go around back, because that's the only other way out of the building. And maybe by chance, he'll come out there. So what happens in the trial is, when he's read the verdict and he's guilty, he passes out. And they come in and put him on a stretcher. And guess what? Because of that, they bring him around back in an ambulance, and we are the only station that gets the shot.
That's great.
So we came back a hero. I didn't really tell anybody. Anyway, there's a lot of great stories like that. But
I remember one. There was it wasn't on the story, but there was a photographer named John Truitt, who may have been there when you were. So John was there, and they were going to open a strip club on a road called 322, which is a 2-lane road, but it was near a neighborhood, and people were quite upset about it. So it became a big story. So they're all camped out. Same thing. Apparently, the story was that all the photographers are out. They're waiting for someone to come out. All they need is a video of someone leaving the strip club. and they're just waiting forever because I guess word that was in there. Nobody's coming out because they don't want to be on TV.
Right.
Well, at some point, John Truitt has to go to the bathroom. So it's like around like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They said, "Oh, why don't you go in?" So he goes in to go to the bathroom. When he comes out, everybody's breaking down their cameras. And I remember being at the station watching. Every station had John Truitt, the photographer, coming out of a strip club saying, and it was something like, customers of the such and such. And it was so funny because they all just got together. And that kind of was the business. It was like, it was harmless fun, but it's like any other job, except it's television.
You know what? I pardon the pun. I may be able to trump that story. Since you mentioned it, this is true. Now, back in 1989, Joe Biden was running for president. So, and this is an interesting time. I'd covered him when I was a reporter before, after McCain, when he was completely bald and got the cornrows and all this sort of thing. Very different time. But in 1989, the news desk said at Channel 29, go down and stake out, and you need to interview him about him running for president. So we went there, Brad and I, and we waited. And just like you were saying, we had to wait for quite a while at his mansion. And, it wasn't like the security you have now. There was a gate, but we could kind of walk around it. So after about 3 hours, I said to Brad, I said, I got to go to the bathroom, and I'm just going to go around the gate into the woods about 100 yards from the front door. So I did that, and I go to the woods. I start to go to the bathroom, and all of a sudden I hear behind me this voice, "Are you quite done?" And it was Joe Biden.
Oh, that's great.
So he's looking at me, we're laughing, and we stayed in touch for a long time, and he still, always made fun of me for that story. But I probably interviewed him, I don't know, 50 or 60 times.
Very gracious. I actually met him in a different way, and it was funny. First of all, the first time he came in, this is a public story, so I'm not giving it any away, but he was very sick, had a brain issue back in the late 80s, went to the hospital, and he came to our hospital where I was a first or second year resident. I was very new in my training. And they said, Joe Biden's here. And I said, I'd like to go into the operating room. And they're like, no, you're not allowed in. You're
right.
But I said, well, why not? They said, because you just can't go in. And I said, all right, I'd like to see the case, but I can't. So a couple of years later, he comes back to this hospital, St. Francis, and he's giving a talk at a big dinner. And of course, he's a senator, so everybody's there listening to him. And he came back to thank people for that initial stage helping save his life. Wow. So I went up to him afterwards and I said, Mr. Senator, you thanked all these people. You didn't thank me. Who are you? And I said, Brian McDonough. And he goes,
right.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, what did you do? I go, well, they wouldn't let me see you. So your life was saved had I seen you. Who knows how it would have went. He mentioned that story so many different times because his memory, but it was a connection, and it was funny. It was stupid, but it was the kind of thing where you see certain politicians to have that skill set that they remember.
Yeah,
they meet so many people, and remember that story. But I always found it interesting because you look back and go like, why would they have let an intern like in that place off? But you think of yourself as, hey, I'm here.
Right. Well, I'll tell you one last story maybe to close on, but really brief. So one of the real pleasures of being a reporter in Philadelphia was covering the mob and covering the mafia. And Brad and I covered a great deal of that. And we covered Nicky Scarfo. He was one of the main guys. And some people don't realize, but in those days, the federal government had a very hard time lassoing these guys, right? These criminals, until they passed what was called the RICO statute, which allowed them to try multiple people at the same time. So in one of those trials, they brought in a lot of guys. Now, a few of these guys had turned against their brethren, right? So there was a lot of bad blood there. And I remember Nicky the Crow Caramandi on the set being interviewed by the prosecution about his life in La Cosa Nostra. And he asked him about it. Did you kill anybody? Yeah. I said, yeah. How many? I lost count. It was like the real Goodfellas. And then I'll never forget what he said. The prosecutor said, well, tell me more about this killing. Because he was allowed to, since he turned government witness, he was spilling the whole beans. He said, let me tell you something. You guys are taking us on right now. And even though I'm testifying against all of my old buddies, there's always going to be a mafia. He said, you're taking us out now, but the Jamaicans and the Russians, they're all going to move in. And he goes, and they're a lot more violent. And he said, and this is what he said, at least we killed for a reason. And I remember thinking at the time, I didn't know what he meant. And then later he explained it. He said, generally speaking, the Italian mafia they wouldn't kill unless there was a reason somebody wronged them. There was a code of honor, a code of ethics. And there's this idea that these other, groups that were getting into the mafia were practicing indiscriminate violence and much, much more dangerous. I think he was right.
Yeah,
But
no.
I'll never forget that phrase, at least we killed for a reason.
Well, and when you're there, I mean, it's one thing to see something like that on TV, but when you're there and it's face to face and you happen to be in that room, those kind of comments are so much more dramatic too.
Yeah, they really are.
They stay with you because it's like, this is not television. Television, I think, has a way of filtering things down because we've seen so many shows and so many situations and such horrific things. But when you're there, it has that impact.
Well, and you know what? I look back, some people asked when I was McCain's press secretary and I was covering the White House, and when I went to Philadelphia, they're like, why are you going to Philly? You could have stayed in Washington. I loved Philadelphia. What an incredible news town. Are you kidding me? All the stuff I just talked about, it's so much grist for the mill. It's a working class town. I grew to love the sports teams. I mean, I really miss it. I lived in Chestnut Hill, lived in Swarthmore. When I first moved there, I lived on South Street because I didn't know better, right at 7th and South. And, it was a charming place to live. It was really special.
Well, Dan Mechem or Richard Nixon, I want to thank you for taking the time. I really enjoyed chatting with you. And before you go, I know your dad, 91 years old, has written a book, and that's all. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Dad, I'll try to make a condensed version. So Dad, back in the day, was the CEO of the company that owned Hanna-Barbera, owned a lot of different TV stations. When they owned Hanna-Barbera, he had the good fortune to meet with Walt Disney and Roy Disney about how to merchandise the characters. And they said, well, do what we did, build amusement parks. So they built their first one in Cincinnati called Kings Island, which is still there, now owned by Paramount. And Jack Nicklaus, who was also from Ohio, like my dad, called him up one time and said, Charlie, I want to build a golf course across from Kings Island. So they did. It became very successful later on the PGA Tour, LPGA. That began a 50-year, very close friendship and business partnership with Jack. And then Dad became, after Taft, was the commissioner of the LPGA from 90 to 95. And in the wake of that success, really turning it around, every major golfer, Watson, Palmer, everybody, Norman, came to Dad and said, look, will you run our companies? And he ended up choosing Arnold Palmer. They were kind of the same age, both from the Midwest. So Dad shared an office with Arnie at Bay Hill, the famous club, for many, many years. And they were friends and so forth for 20, 30 years. And then out where I live here now in Palm Springs, in a town called La Quinta, my father and Arnie's family lived next door to each other for 20 years. So in that context, Dad gave a speech about a year ago about Jack and Arnie and kind of talking about some of his memories and how the guys felt about each other and the old days about Arnie's Army, things like that. And one of his friends said, Charlie, you probably know more about these two men, their relationship with each other, and really everything there is to know than anybody in the world. So he agreed. He thought, okay, I'm going to write a book. I'm 91. So it's lighting up the sports world. It's just been unbelievable. We just put it out about a month ago. Dad's doing interviews on all these podcasts, and he just was on the Golf Channel, Sports Illustrated. But, it's a unique window into that nostalgic time of these two icons, right? One of the greatest rivalries in sports. And Dad answers a lot of questions. Like, there's a lot of things he talks about that you're not going to see anywhere else in any other book. And one of the questions he answers is, did they really like each other? And the truth is that they were very, very close friends, and their wives were as well. So it's a great time in my dad's life. I'm happy to help him with it. And so thanks for asking about it. It's on Amazon if people want to buy the book.
Yeah, great.
So, yeah.
That'd be great. And certainly love to have him on the show sometime when he has time as well. It'd be great.
Absolutely.
I think people are interested, and the world of podcasts is great because your father not only can talk about it, but it wouldn't be the abridged 90-second story you normally get on TV. Yeah, you can actually talk, and I would imagine some of those stories, it's the expansive story and the emotion and the memories that come out that probably are the best parts of the interview. So
yeah, and I think that people are so fascinated by Jack Nicklaus and Arnold, and there's such royalty that people just eat it up just to understand a little more about what made them tick, the kind of people they were. And I'll tell you this, it's interesting in closing. In my career as a reporter interviewing presidents and Nixon and all these famous people over the years, I met a lot of extraordinary men and women. But Arnold Palmer had a charisma and a magnetism unlike anything I've ever seen. When he walked into a room, that room changed. I mean, it materially changed, and he made everyone feel special. He remembered everybody's name. You know, the person that kind of came a close second to me was Bill Clinton. Clinton had that same charisma where he'd walk in and, you know, make everybody feel special, and had kind of an encyclopedic memory about people's names. But Arnie was just beloved and really larger than life.
Well, Dan Mechem, thank you so much taking the time to join me on the program. And again, anybody's watching, if you're still watching, that means you enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Please subscribe, and we'll talk to you on the next Dr. Brian McDonough Show.
The Dr. Brian McDonough Show.